Welcome, everybody. If you don't know me, my name is Sari. I am the Public Programs Director of MOFAD. We're the Museum of Food and Drink. I'm so excited to have you all join us tonight. We have a super interesting event. I know a lot of you are probably used to us doing cooking demos and things like that. So I'm excited to share a very kind of unique opportunity with all of you tonight. I'm so glad you decided to come. Fabio is a professor at NYU Food Studies, which happens to be my alma mater. So it's really exciting to be able to bring him to MOFAD for this event. So just a couple things. The chat will be open tonight. There will be time kind of towards the end for a more general discussion where you can pop your questions into the chat and we'll try and get to them just as the conversation goes on. Fabio is going to give a presentation first, so we'll watch that. And then there'll be a little bit of time to hear from our panel and then a more general discussion where you can feel free to add your questions, and I'll come back for that as well to help facilitate. Just letting more people in here. Totally fine for you to keep your cameras on, just to note that we are recording. So, just want to give you a heads up about that. And that's really all I'm going to say for tonight. I'm going to have all of our panelists introduce themselves. We have Brian and Maria, who are both contributors to Fabio's book that he edited, Global Brooklyn, which some of you ordered. So let's start with Maria and have her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I am an associate professor at Georgetown in the Department of History and American Studies.
Thanks. And Brian?
My name is Brian Moe, and I'm an assistant professor in the Communication Studies Department at Biola University in Southern California.
Thanks, Brian. And of course, Fabio, I'm going to have you introduce yourself, but just pass it over and let you start the program. So everyone enjoy, and I'll see you a little bit later.
Hello, everybody. I'm Fabio Parasecoli. I'm a professor at NYU in the Nutrition and Food Studies Department, and I'm the co-editor of this book together with Mateusz Halawa at the Polish Academy of Science. He could not be here, but we'll talk a little bit about the project, how it developed, and then we'll start the conversation. So if it's okay, I will start with this short presentation. It's just to launch the discussion. It's not meant to be a lecture. We'll try to keep the event as laid back and relaxed as possible. We're really looking forward also to your feedback. So let me see if I can share. There we go. So this is the cover of our book, Global Brooklyn: Designing Food Experiences in World Cities. And I know that some of you have bought it. By the way, the author of this picture is Iranian. This is a picture from a town in Iran. And he saw the book published and he got in touch with us to tell us he was very happy of how the picture was used. But, those weird things that happen in publishing. So what's this project about? It came out of our travels and our experiences and the fact that we were going around the world for work or for fun, and we found ourselves in places that somehow looked the same. And so we started thinking about that, and Mateusz and I first published an article about it, and then we decided to expand the project a little bit. And so we got in touch with people we knew around the world, asking them if our hunches about this phenomenon that we decided to call Global Brooklyn, and we'll talk more about why we call it that, and what it means. We asked them to see where they are, if the phenomenon is there, how it's similar to what happens, in, I don't know, in the US. Is Mumbai different from Kyoto or from Rio de Janeiro? And we wanted to make it a book with different voices. So we have other academics like Brian and Mireia here, but we also had a food critic from Accra. We had a couple of designers. We had an entrepreneur. we wanted to have a diversity also of tones in the book and different points of view. So these are all the contributions, and we were very happy with the final result. I hope you'll enjoy, the diversity of the book too. So what is Global Brooklyn? Well, we came up with this name because that's how we referred it to. So in Paris, you might hear a certain style of restaurants and cafes. We'll talk more about the characteristics, but overall, it's like the blackboards and the recycled woods and the mismatched furniture and the Edison bulbs and the weird object used to serve food. Are places that are really very common now in all large and small cities. In Paris, you would hear place, oh, c'est très beau clean. And we heard that in Shanghai and in Mumbai. And so we decided to call it that, Global Brooklyn. But we are fully aware that the origins are not just in Brooklyn. It's actually a mix of different locations that started developing this very specific aesthetic. And so here, for instance, on the right, we have the Black Cat punk bar in Seattle. It was, very famous back in the 80s, early 90s before it closed. On the left, we have a bar in Berlin, and Seattle, Berlin, Portland were some of the cities where this aesthetic developed. Sometimes as a form of protest, sometimes as a form of squatting. The punk bar on purpose was in a semi-abandoned place that was taken care of, and so people started adding furniture, and that's the final effect. In Berlin, there was the effect of the reunification, and the city was changing, and so empty places started becoming this sort of bar and restaurant. And then there's Brooklyn, of course, where the phenomenon is very, very visible. Here on the left, we have the Wythe Hotel that some of you might be familiar with in Williamsburg, and Williamsburg itself. So why this reference to Brooklyn? We figured out it's because of the strength of US media. And so you have movies, you have series that take place in these neighborhoods and present this aesthetic as the modern face of Brooklyn. On top of that, Brooklyn already has a very strong presence in media, and so in the global imaginary. Think about all the movies that take place there in New York, Saturday Night Live, the mafia movies, and so on and so forth. So I think Brooklyn was already very much there in people's imaginary, and these new trends, for that reason, got somehow, not always, but quite often identified with it. What's the result of this? It's what we call decentralized sameness, meaning that although there is no project, there is no central place of command that determines what things should look like or feel like, they end up looking and feeling the same. So on the left here, you have a pasta place in my neighborhood in Rome, actually on my street. It's called Ziarilla, amazing pasta. And on the right, you have the Slow Bakery in Rio de Janeiro, the old place. They have recently relocated to a new location. But you can see that the old furniture, the recycled furniture, the objects, mismatched object, the lighting, the preference for this wood and metal, it's quite similar, although in completely different places. And I'm sure that the owners didn't communicate to come up with this. But the result of this circulation, and we'll talk more about that, is this decentralized sameness. As a contrast, different locations try to bring something of the local. On the left is a place I visited in Calicut, in Kerala, southern India, where you have the global Brooklyn aesthetic, but with lots of local accents. You know, the use of the wood, it's recycled wood, but it's the recycled wood of that place. And so it looked in a certain place. The milk containers that are hanging there are definitely from that place. So one way to do this is bring elements of the contest into the restaurants and the cafe. The other way, and those are the pictures on the right, are to bring ingredients from the place. This is a cafe in Chiang Mai, in northern Thailand. And the people there decided to use local cafe and ingredients that they grew really in the backyard, basically in the back of the restaurant. So there is some desire of embracing this global aesthetic, but also the desire of maintaining their distinctiveness. Very often, and this is probably one of the topics we'll discuss a lot, this new aesthetic is connected with gentrification. So we have whole neighborhoods that change. You have new cute bars and restaurants and stores taking the place of maybe bodegas or older mainstays in the community. Very often at the beginning, it's artists that venture in neighborhoods that have a bad rap, or they are semi-abandoned, or they were working neighborhoods where the productive activities had left. And so there are lots of empty spaces. But the result is the same. You have newcomers that come in, they bring their own interests, their own preferences, their own taste. And very soon they're followed by restaurants, cafes, and stores that cater to them. And sometimes, actually very often, this is not just a random phenomenon, and we'll talk more about that, but real estate developers are very much involved in this. And here we have two examples. On the left, we have a place for Pilsen in Chicago, and that's the place about which Mireia wrote in the book. And on the right, we have Echo Park, which on the other hand, is in LA. And Brian's article was mostly focused on LA, although as we will see, he talked mostly about food trucks. Because of this, very often this aesthetic is connected with hipsters. And with a certain generation, clients of a certain age, or at least that was the case at the beginning. But now we see this sort of places popping up also in very affluent communities. I don't know, upstate New York on the Hudson, or in, you know, nice places in the Hamptons, where definitely, you know, there might be hipsters, but they're also, you know, boomers or people like me, Gen Xers, with some income. So the aesthetic is not only expanded in terms of geography, but also in terms of generations that are somehow attracted to it. So what are the characteristics of this? In the book, we launched sort of the challenge to all the contributors to look at 5 dimensions, 5 aspects. The first one, of course, is design. And we've already mentioned some of the characteristic, the recycled wood, the old metal. Very often the built environment is somehow recycled. It's an old warehouse. It's a place that has been abandoned. There is a lot of interest also for graphic design. It looks sort of put together randomly. It's not. Very often there is a lot of design thinking, work of designers, and you can see it in the menus, in the way the printed menus, and also the menus on blackboards. And one of the sort of more interesting elements is how this aesthetic has also influenced food trucks, and that's Brian's research. So we see also the interest for certain fonts, the colors, the overall layout. It's very much studied. The second dimension, it's sort of a shift in the sensory world of these places. So there is a preference, for instance, for orange wines or natural wines, for third wave coffee, for fermented products. You know, here we have vegetables, and on the right we have kombucha. Many stores make kombucha on the spot, and it's part of their sort of their DNA. In a way, there is an interest for flavors that are supposed to reflect a more natural state of the ingredient, the original scents and aromas, for instance, in the case of the coffee and the wine. For people, let's say my generation, especially wines, at first were like, okay, this wine is wrong. Somebody, you know, made a mistake while was making it, but no, it's on purpose very often, because the wine is supposed to reflect the characteristic of the grapes and the place with as little intervention of the winemaker. So this is the result. The third dimension, and this is a very important one, is the media. Global Brooklyn developed thanks to media, and we believe that that's why it became such a global phenomenon. Because people take pictures of where they eat, what they eat, they post it. And so suddenly, I don't know, people in Korea can see what's cool in Brooklyn, and people in Brooklyn can see, oh, but that bar in Mumbai is really cute. Maybe we can use part of it. So there is this circulation of images in which also the consumers, the people that go to the restaurants or to the stores, are co-producers, because basically you're doing the marketing for them. And you're creating an aesthetic that then new entrepreneurs want to embrace, to be cool, to be, you know, interesting, and to attract a certain kind of clientele. So we believe that this phenomenon couldn't have happened without media, and especially social media and the visual ones. Here I have a picture on Instagram, because we believe that Instagram, Pinterest, and then later on TikTok and other visual social media were very important for the diffusion, the global diffusion of this style. Expertise. There is a lot of information that goes back and forth between clients and the people on the other side of the counter. I don't know, you go and get a coffee and you have 15 different coffees from different parts of the world, and you will have a barista that it's there to explain to you the different flavors, the different characteristics.
He had a new book come out.
I think there is somebody with the mic on. I lost my train of thought. Oh, yes. So there is a lot of circulation of information in the menus. Very often, you know, there is a sandwich and they will explain exactly what the different ingredients are, where they come from. Sometimes even, you know, the producer, I don't know if you remember the famous Portland sketch about the two guys, the couple that goes to the restaurant and the one know about the chicken. Basically, it's this sort of philosophy of approach where you have to know a lot about food to present it properly and also to consume it properly. You know, customers somehow expect this sort of knowledge shared with them. Last but not least is a revaluation of craft. So manual jobs, you know, blue collar jobs now are embraced by people that have university degrees, they decide to become butchers or baristas or start roasting coffee. So this sort of jobs have acquired a different social status, which allow many people to enjoy them and make a living out of them. I'm not sure about the parents who paid for college, but it's definitely one of the characteristics of this approach to hospitality. And this is the last slide of the presentation. We did our work also. We said that Global Brooklyn expanded and spread thanks to social media. We decided to use social media to do our research. So we created this hashtag, Global Brooklyn, and people started posting. As a matter of fact, I've put in the presentation my Instagram handle, and it's also for Twitter. If you have pictures, share them. We actually created over time a gallery that goes with the book, with pictures from all over the world. And I've had other researchers, friends, former students now sending pictures. So that the gallery is growing and growing. And as soon as I finish this presentation and I have access back to the chat, I will post the link so you can start, browsing it while you listen to us. And I would finish here. I hope it was not too long. There we go. And I'm going to post the link right now in the chat for everybody to browse. Right now it sits in my website, but if it grows more than it's already growing, we might have to think otherwise because it's taking its own, a life of its own. So we decided that, we will start a conversation among the three of us and then we'll open up. And I would start actually asking Brian a question. So how did it happen that the Global Brooklyn aesthetic met the streets, with food trucks?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say thank you again, Fabio, for bringing me onto this project. It's been wonderful working with you and all the authors throughout this experience. If you guys haven't already, I would highly recommend the book. Mine has a very short piece, so I'm not a big contributor, so I just got to say that up front. But it's a great piece, and partially because I think for me, it represents kind of a time period in which I think we haven't had a lot of reflection on, but we've had a lot of impact from, and that is the global recession that came out of 2008. In fact, the food truck story often starts there. And so that's what was pretty interesting to me, of when this kind of new aesthetic is kind of growing and kind of being pushed, right, to some degree, some kind of internal momentum of sorts, right? Somebody saw this, they liked this, something just felt right when they saw this one thing, like Fabio said, in Portland or in a bar in Paris. And they start to kind of collaborate. And now there's a time of need in which they need to create something new, right? Now the food truck isn't new. Let's just be real. Like, it is not, right? We've had food trucks in Los Angeles called taco trucks or lancherias for a long time, right? Before that, we had tamale cars. Before that, we had lunch wagons, right? On the East Coast. And before that, we had chuck wagons that all kind of did the same thing. But in our public consciousness, 2008 really did kind of bring about this kind of new creation called the food truck, in which you and I kind of identify with all of a sudden, right? And in doing so, part of that identification is a lot of bringing up this global Brooklyn aesthetic. And the first one to point out, right, is social media. How are you going to find a moving object without social media? Right? In LA in particular, right? Nobody walks in LA. It's a song, right? For most of us, we understand that. You need to be able to drive stuff. And even in that, that's part of the adventure, right? I remember my first time going to other cities, Chicago and in New York, right? Where you have a good rail system, and that's an adventure in and of itself to try to get on those things and navigate and see the city. For us in LA, it's through traffic, through going down a new alley to being guided there. So this first kind of like sensory thing we get, right, is brought to you by social media. And the people that first embraced them, especially within the food trucks, created a persona, right, that people started to engage with. So it became this other thing too. It wasn't just to locate them, you needed it, right? But it became this feedback. You almost had direct access. And the way I kind of put it is that you kind of broke this like wall of sorts. The chef, the creator, and the person who is engaging with it, there's less there. There's not a French door, you know, that you have to go through that swings, that kind of reveals the backstage a little bit. It's supposed to be right there in front of you. Now, whether that's true or not, right? It's that veil of social media, but it's still there. So it really picks up on that kind of Brooklyn aesthetic of like, I can sense something different, right? There's a feeling that goes along with this thing, and social media kind of brings that to us. So that was really kind of interesting. In terms of design, Fabio showed a picture, like it's a truck with wood paneling, right? It serves no purpose other than aesthetic, right? That thing's gonna rot in most places in the United States, whether it's too hot in our Southwest or too cold in our Northeast. Like Portland, good luck having something wood out in the rain all year. Like it's not, so it is truly an aesthetic, but it's something that brings people to the truck. Now, it's not just that, it could also be in LA, it could be something that just kind of brings out the locality, right? That kind of represent that. And I would point to one of the more famous trucks, that would be the Kogi Truck, brought to you by Chef Roy Choi. You might even know his name from things like his contributions in the movie of Chef, and just his general personality on Food Network shows and stuff like that. And what he kind of brought was he intentionally brought the locality of LA into the design of his trucks. He got something, he actually has a retrofitted taco truck, Luncheria. And what he's done is he's added graffiti to it, right? He's added stickers to it. So you're gonna see surf stickers, right? A lot of his first local locations were towards the beaches in Venice, and other collaborations. So when you look at it, you know it's not a taco truck, but you also know it's kind of hip and not scary, but it could have been like a year or two earlier. It could have been an unidentifiable, right, spray painted truck, but all of a sudden now this hip thing comes along, right, and people want to start getting in line with it and start taking pictures with it, putting it up on their social media and showing where they were and having this kind of like, oh, I'm engaging in this new thing. On top of that, Roy Choi, and just to bring him out, and he's one of many, so he's not alone, is that he also started to bring expertise and craft into this, where it kind of had been assumed there was not. And I'm not going to say there wasn't craft. In fact, most people working luncherias or taco trucks are very skillful, right? Very skillful. And so it has nothing to do with that. But he brought in like kind of this like more Western idea of prestige. He went to culinary school. He won some awards, did some chef work in very prestigious locations, and even opened up his own restaurant. But because of the 2008, 2009 recession, chefs looking for new ideas, somebody says, let's get into a truck, let's do that. And so all of a sudden he brings in the social media aspects, right? A little bit more tech savvy, kind of understands that, a little bit younger of a generation. He brings in the design that he's kind of feeling like the localness, the kind of coolness of the place, right? It can be kind of industrial, right? He starts to bring in his own expertise where he's blending that local flavors. He's Korean American himself, and he's bringing that Korean style into a California burrito and a taco. Right? He also does a hot dog. So he kind of really tries to do his service with technique and craft into that. And the last thing that he points out is that this is a blue collar type of work, right? He really does highlight as best as he can the workers that are there. Oftentimes, he gives a lot of credit to the chefs that create his food, right? Because he's not in every truck. Now, he was at the beginning, but just like any big chef who's running multiple things, they no longer cook in all the kitchens. But who does he trust? He trusts the Latino women, right? Almost, at least in the trucks, almost all in his trucks to do the cooking. And he highlights that and tries to bring that up because he understands that they are the ones who make the flavors. He's even gone and they make changes to the menu. They help out with things. And so he reflects back on the people who are actually making the food, and he tries to give that Now, I don't have the numbers to actually support whether or not he pays them the fairest of wages. Now, I'm assuming he is based on his other restaurant called Local, in which the actual initiative of the restaurant was to pay a fair and livable wage working at a restaurant. They also hired from within the local community there. So that's kind of my little like, hey, food trucks fit into this thing. And it's kind of cool to see how it does it. Now it gets a little bit more controversial. I think this is where we're going to start to pop over and see it because, well, is it cool that a taco truck rebranded sort of as a food truck, it gets to kind of take the credit and shine away from a community that's been doing this for a long time and actually faced a lot of the burdens in Los Angeles in particular and many other areas to keep it alive, to keep street food alive, right? And so there's a real part of this that gentrification starts seeping in, even with this kind of humble, I'm just in a truck trying to serve people in the streets, it starts to get wonky. So this is kind of where I want to pass it off. And maybe Fabio has another couple of questions that we can go off of.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. So continuing talking about, how this connects with gentrification. Mireia, you wrote your piece about Chicago and especially about Latino neighborhoods that saw a change over time. And you particularly looked at one restaurateur that you know and how that place changed. So looking at all this, this long history of some of these places, do they erase the complexities, the differences of the places who lived there, of the people who lived there and people who inhabited those places?
Well, thanks, Fabio, for inviting me. I see some really great friends and colleagues in the audience, and it's so awesome to see everyone. I mean, for me, it is partly a complicated story. The piece I wrote about was really a kind of reflection of my own neighborhood getting gentrified, and really all of the restaurants that I saw shutter, Mexican restaurants, panaderias, corner shops. And what I was astounded by in the 90s is that they were going out one by one, shutting down. And part of the process of gentrification is this need for these incoming communities, not only to buy low, but to assume that once the community leaves, that their property values will be higher. So there's dollars and cents to gentrification, and there's wealth that people are basically making with the expulsion of these communities that they're deciding to basically buy in. And the signposts were all of these signposts that were, for me, around food. They were the coffee shop, as Fabio mentions. They were basically a now hip, pie shop. All of this had a food lexicon. And the oddest thing for me was that as I was basically in graduate school, learning more about the world, I felt very comfortable in these new spaces. But what I noticed is many of my community did not feel comfortable. They did not feel comfortable. They did not feel welcome. That entire space felt very closed off. And it's not that people don't have the dollars and cents to walk in. It's that when you don't look like most of the clientele, at times people aren't as friendly. They're not as kind. They're not as attentive. They're not always attuned to who in the community was there prior to their landing, right? And so, to my amazement, in the 2000s, the taco was once again back. And it was once again back, but now through this new landscape of that I would call is the global Brooklyn aesthetics of gentrification, right? So the taqueria now had cool awnings. The taqueria now was owned by different people. But lo and behold, you look at who worked in the restaurant, it was still the same people. And so what ends up happening in these spaces is that I noticed the Latinx community was locked out of these entrepreneurial spaces where they were building wealth for others. And these weren't always the best of jobs, because we all know work in restaurants is tough and often underpaid, uninsured. And I thought about what this looked like in my neighborhood, but I also thought about what it looked like in, at that point, my best friend's neighborhood. She logged in today, Marisol, in Pilsen, and she saw the same thing. In her neighborhood, though, the one thing that was more frustrating is that she came from one of the most historically important Mexican neighborhoods in Chicago, Pilsen. And she saw the food lexicon also being used to erase these communities. And so people use narratives about the Eastern European roots. People use narratives about the Czechs building the neighborhood, and forgot conveniently in these talks, in these discussions, to talk about why they had abandoned the inner city and who were the inheritors of this space and who had made this space their own. And so on one level, it was the erasure, but on the other, it was also, again, the food symbols, the sauerkrauts, the beer places, the sausages coming back full force. And all the while, on the sidelines, there again would be taquerias, but taquerias with a very different approach. And I, for my piece, wanted to talk to basically a chef who understood as a Latinx chef what the landscape looked like. And he basically is like, I have to cater to gentrifiers in order to survive, but I also want to cater to my community because I open this place for them as well. And so part of it is the politics of erasure, but also the dollars and cents around gentrification and the way food is not necessarily the unifying factor, but usually a factor that erases and marginalizes.
Mm-hmm. So, by the way, there is a great show on Netflix, and we had conversations about it called Attentive, which is precisely about a taqueria that gets gentrified in a Los Angeles neighborhood. If you guys have not watched it, I recommend it. It's a very, very good show, precisely about these topics we're discussing. But let's start, our conversation, and continuing what Mireia was discussing and Brian was saying. What do you think? Are we going to see? So this global Brooklyn, it is just an erasure, something that cancels and destroys something, or is it something that creates a new synthesis, something that we'll be able to recognize down the line as we go into the future? I will ask Brian and Mireia. I know you guys have different experiences of that and different approaches. What do you think?
Okay, yeah, I'll be happy to go first. And in fact, I think where I come from literally reflects where I've come from, and that is growing up in Los Angeles, on the outskirts of the downtown area, but still in Los Angeles, no doubt. In fact, my hometown has been actually wonderfully gentrified. In fact, in the weirder direction, we were actually gentrified in fact of Taiwanese culture and a lot of diaspora from mainland China, and especially during my time growing up. And it's been wonderful. And here's why. One, our food got better, right? Things like right, school systems seem to get better. Like, I know that sounds weird, but it was my general experience in that. Now that might be that it was a wealth influx, right? That could partially be part of the thing. But I've also noticed that in that, a lot of my Latino friends that I grew up with, they all kind of like the kind of Brooklyn aesthetic too, right? These are people that are first or second generation oftentimes. And so I'm wondering, like, well, is this aesthetic coming into parts of town and taking over certain things? Is that always bad? Because the people that I grew up with, who I would identify, or they would even identify as being of color or of a part of a group, right, that needs more diversity representation, they like those things. They liked going to food trucks. For example, you see some of the first pictures that ever came out of those who going to Roy Choi's food trucks, and those are in it. It's a wealth of diversity, of Asian faces, of Hispanic faces, of white faces. So it's quite interesting to me to going like, where are the limits with this? Because I know as an academic, there's problems, right? So where do we start to find that middle ground and have that conversation? is tough. It's really tough.
Well, I mean, for me, I think it is complicated. And one of the realities is that, you know, they're not all of these like very joyous spaces. And I enjoy the hipster tacos. I enjoy these third wave coffees. And I think part of it is that it is the symbol of being middle class. It is a symbol of belonging. It is a symbol of also food knowledge. It's a symbol of entry into a space. And so it's not surprising that communities of color who are striving to be middle class also take on this lexicon to belong, right? And so it's not that I dislike the stuff. I actually find it fascinating, but then I also find it equally troubling that there's only particular kinds of young folks that can enter those spaces. And you're not going to see my grandmother there. You know, you're not going to see my mother there because they're not made to cater to them or to make them feel comfortable. And so I think that's part of the kind of the tension here, that yes, it's not surprising that communities of color want entry into these spaces. I mean, if these are the dominant spaces that show class, wealth, knowledge, culture, why wouldn't they want entry?
I just want to remind everybody that if you have questions, just add them to the chat. It's difficult to, there are like 50 different windows, so it's hard to follow who's there or not, but if it's in the chat, we can see it, and we'd be happy to answer if we can. Actually, we have an observation from Stephanie that says, I have a different take on the appropriation of cultural symbols like tacos into a global and aesthetic conversation by artistic groups and cultural markets. It is not only co-opted culture, but rather a special kind of blending and spotlight. So clearly the points of view on these processes, you know, are quite different depending also on, you know, who's speaking, what's the point of view, what are the different experiences as a matter of fact. For me, what's been very interesting, it's trying to understand how these dynamics that here in the US we interpret in a certain way play in a completely different way. For instance, in my native Rome, or in Shanghai, or in Mumbai. And there the topics of gentrification, appropriation, playing in a completely different context. So it's one of the difficulties of dealing with a global phenomenon. There are some shared elements, but at the same time, there are lots of also local characteristics that intervene with that. Before that, I saw that Christopher said, I wonder how much Jonathan Gold, the LA Times food critic who focused on smaller locations and food trucks, had breaking those barriers, using the power of traditional print media powerhouses that opened the door for diners to feel safe to explore these spaces in a time when social media was just starting to take off. Yes, at the beginning, probably in the 90s, there was still, you know, the power of the food critic, but that would explain the notoriety of a place, you know, in a city or maybe at the national level. What we're trying to make sense here is that you have these same places popping up in Rio de Janeiro and in Chiang in Thailand. And at that point, I doubt also for questions of language that printed media might have had such a big influence. Visual media are more immediate. They don't need translation, you know. Things look in a certain way, and the aesthetic elements can be picked in an easier way, as a matter of fact. Stephanie also continues, this has happened before, and so in the 70s, a strongly artistic group cohabitated there, and the Soho aesthetic proliferated the globe. Now it is Brooklyn, and the cultures there, Latino, are swept into the spotlight. That would not exist otherwise. Yes, of course, you know, these are cyclical phenomenon. The only difference between the Soho experience and now, again, is social media. And I don't think we can discount that in terms of outreach, in terms of, you know, the Soho aesthetic could be enjoyed by people that have access to certain cultural circulations that read certain kind of things. Now, anybody with a cell phone can go into Instagram and look at that. So it goes, I think the dynamic could be quite different.
It almost works as if it's kind of this democratization of aesthetic pleasures, right? I get a larger voice or a more amplified voice to say, this is what I think is beautiful for the moment, right? And and when that gets enough amplitude, right, it becomes this kind of tidal wave, and it seems to come in it with great anticipation, like a wildfire. I'm using mixed metaphors here, I apologize, but like it comes in like a wildfire, and in some ways it's going to help rejuvenate certain things, right? Maybe in Soho it helped with certain things, but in certain parts of LA it's not. We have a renter's crisis and an ownership crisis here, right? And gentrification is a part of that, and the food that comes into these places is a symbol of it. And when you can mobilize that quickly with a co-opted, this is really important, food truck, right? That's going to say I'm a Latin-owned taqueria truck that's coming in, when you know for a fact it's not, right? But it's going to sell that. There's some big problems there, because it's just real. It's just making it more complicated, right? Because I think there's something beautiful about the global Brooklyn aesthetic that like anybody anywhere can kind of put up industrial looking stuff, because it's pipe, it's wood, you can sand it, you can do it manually, right? Use screws, like you can do it, you can fix it. There's something crafter about it. Like if you have certain access to tools and resources, you can build this. It doesn't take big 3D printing, you know, McDonald's chairs, right? Yeah.
I would differ here. I actually think that the global aesthetic is costly. And I think that when you think about the dollars and cents, and I constantly think about the dollars and cents that some of these Latino-owned places put into their environment, sometimes initially some, but this global Brooklyn aesthetic costs money. I mean, the best, most beautiful places not only have these mismatched chairs that you think, well, they didn't cost much, but they actually did. And everything is carefully curated. And I think it actually is costly. I mean, what I see over and over, at least for the spaces in, you know, LA and Chicago, and to some degree in New York, but the footprint is much more limited, is that they actually have to remodel and gut the entire space to reveal sometimes that tin ceiling, or to basically utilize an old vault to dine in. So it's not cheap.
Sari, you have a question.
I do, but also there's a couple questions that came into the chat, and just apropos to exactly what Maria was saying, Rana just wrote in that hanging an Edison light bulb means you can charge 25% more for your food and beverage, and just wanted to hear you talk. So I don't know if there's anything else, like you did just speak to that, but if there's anything else you want to say, just to like jacking up the food and beverage, you know, prices, just because you've created like a certain aesthetic.
Yeah, so when it comes to the democratization, there is still, you know, these places are not cheap in many ways. In different parts of the world, you know, where you see them, you realize that they are sort of for people with a little more, not, you know, rich people, but people with a little more income. Even in the place in Calicut, you know, on the coast of Kerala, you could tell that not everybody would go there. Not only because of the slightly higher cost, but also because it feels different, you know. It can be intimidating in a certain way. So the issue of democratization is quite complicated there, because democratizations among whom to a certain point. And here I'm reading what Stephanie said, these are two separate issues, cultural production and unsustainable real estate development practices. The problem here is that the two have overlapped. Even the most sincere, young kids that move into an abandoned neighbor, or the adventurous artists, they're involuntary gentrifiers. There is no way around it. They, in the long run, they will displace the local community. So even if their intentions are good, there is a tension between intentions and structure. Structure, social stratification, structural racism. We cannot just base on, what we feel and what we think we're doing. What's the actual impact? And you see that a little bit also in other places around the world.
Yeah, there's also a great question from Tim. There's an interesting tension between the bland global modernism of the whitewashed walls, mid-century modern furniture, and industrial fittings, and the extreme specificity that comes from hyper-local ingredients and fermented foods. How do we understand this mix of generic and specific, especially in a place like Brooklyn, where so many people are recent immigrants to their neighborhoods and don't have centuries deep cultural roots?
Mm-hmm. This is an interesting one. I'll start, and then if you guys want to jump in. I think that
Hey, Fabio, you just
specifically that place.
Fabio?
Oh, hear me? Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, do you mind, can you just start over? Because you froze for a minute.
I think different understandings of what local means. Am I on? Hello?
Hey, yeah, you just froze for a minute there. I think you're coming back.
Am I on now? Okay. I don't know how much you heard. I'll restart again. Sorry. These are the pleasures of
Sorry.
the internet.
Start again. Thanks.
No, no problem. I mean, teaching online, you get used to this. So I think that one answer to that question is understanding what we mean by local. And there are different understandings. In a place that has roots, local means something. So the Global Brooklyn Place on my street in Rome serves pasta and handmade pasta with Roman recipes, even if in that kind of aesthetic. In Brooklyn, as you have people coming from all over the world, what does local mean? Does it mean using ingredients within, I don't know, 200 miles? Does it mean that the kombucha is prepared on premises? I think that the concept of locality has become quite flexible because it's a reflection of globalization. I think our care about locality, the fact that we want to have local food, is a reflection of the fact that we feel we live in a globalized world where we don't have points of reference. And so we try to establish locality in any way we can. And if we're in Brooklyn, we do it in one way. If we're in Rome, maybe we do it differently. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I guess when it comes to Mexican food, I always think that the local is quite a distinct conversation. We all love those avocados. And if you're on the East Coast, guess what? They're not local. We all love the chilies that, guess what? If you're on the East Coast, they might have come from somewhere else. They're not local. And I think we romanticize this idea. And we also think about these things because they're not local. We also think that these people don't have a history in these places and haven't made home in these places for decades and decades. So in a place like Chicago, oftentimes people will look at me and say, well, there's no Mexicans in Chicago. And when I say a quarter of the city population is Latinx, and they've had food traditions that span the entire 20th century. And they make do with local things, sure, but they also have a tradition of importing, of bringing in products that are really important to keeping that food culture alive. And so I never think of this as a one-way conversation, because I do think that for communities that have these really complicated histories with migration, they've had to adapt, they've had to import, they've had to think about their food traditions in a global way. They've just had to. And so maybe the kind of stuff that someone serves, in this place in Chicago may not be the most local, but I will say in certain neighborhoods, it is the traditional fare of that neighborhood, of that place. And it does have deep roots in that space.
Yeah, this connects to the whole discussion about what is authentic, right? It's contextual. It's if you've lived in that neighborhood for 60 years, the food that you prepare there, it's authentic and it's original and all of that.
Way to steal my point, Fabio. I was going
Oh.
right there, buddy. That's where I was going. No, because you're so right. It's like, we have some great books written on kind of the taco by, is it Gustavo?
Arellano.
Yep. And then also, who wrote the other one? I'm blanking. Jeremy Pilcher?
Mhm.
Right? I think those books for me, especially somebody from Southern California, was really impactful to kind of go, oh, wow, like authenticity is really complicated. And so when I tell people I get authentic food in Los Angeles, I'm lying, but I'm not. And so I'm just like, okay, how does that work? And so when people say that you can't have Korean Mexican, I'm like, well, wait a minute. Yeah, you can. And it is authentic because somebody who grew up in Los Angeles eating tacos and his parents' Korean food made that thing out of the experiences that they had from the local area. In fact, there's even a little bit of like dirt that got in there, probably from the dust of the freeway, right? So it's even taken up that terroir of the local asphalt of Los Angeles, right? And smog. So that's really wonderful. And so I think authenticity is just such a cool, messy, complicated subject that then gets thrown into the debate of gentrification, because what is authentic for this neighborhood? And it's just like, I don't know. I don't know yet. But what I would like to see more of is ask the people who are there, living there. What do you want for your communities? Do you want more taco trucks in your community? You want more food trucks in your community? You want better parks like that? Like, let's start there and start asking, because I think we're going to get even cooler stuff because we have the ability to do it, right? And we all know the term gentrification now, and we know, starting to understand the signs. I think now it's time that we can really start to take action towards really mitigating those negative effects of even the most, like Fabio said, kind-minded people that want to move in somewhere nicely and hopefully help to rebuild the city. We're still taking part of a displacement, right? We're pointing towards something, but it also distracts us from something else, and it's really complicated.
So we have question/observation from Gino. Is this partly the savvy of Brooklyn looking outward throughout the world and finding important elements of itself, rather than the global cities making reference to or being aware of the Brooklyn trends knowingly? We can all learn from this. Looking outward to find yourself or element of yourself is very interesting and important. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a good observation. And again, for me, we can read this phenomenon only if we think about, the specific kind of globalization we are living in. And so our identities and who we are determined by so many factors that, sometimes it's what's in your family, what's in your neighborhood, but sometimes you find your identity in, I don't know, a very far away place. It's quite inevitable, I think, at this point.
Thanks, Fabio. I'll just ask my quick little question to everyone.
Sure.
This is just like the lightning round for the end. So we see global Brooklyn, obviously. That's very pronounced throughout the world. Is there another trend? Is there another location you can imagine kind of popping up in the same way, being, what's the word,
Yeah.
represented in the same way that the Brooklyn aesthetic was?
who knows? I mean, in the past, we had different waves. We had the phase of the French bistro, right? You had this aesthetic of the bistro, of the comptoir, many elements that became popular. We had also the phase of the sushi bar, where objects look the same and the wood and the environment look the same. But in that case, the aesthetic and the material reflected one specific culinary style. Here, I don't think that Global Brooklyn reflects one national cuisine or one national culinary style. So I think from that point of view, it's different. Down the line, who knows? I mean, certain objects have been circulated on purpose to give, the perception of a place. So we're used to see this weird lamps and sculptures in Chinese restaurants that you would never see in China. Unless now I've seen them in China, but used ironically, which is also a very hipster sort of attitude. So you have places in China that adopt pieces of the Chinese restaurant abroad, which I find quite intriguing in a way.
Yeah. You just got to figure that people are going to get sick of Brooklyn at some point, or Brooklyn's going to get sick of itself and then, evolve to the next iteration.
Who knows? Maybe the next one will be Queens.
Yeah.
I think the next trends are going to revolve around real individual self-identity. So I think a real kind of breaking up of kind of some of these global trends, but the global trend will be like me. And I think part of that has to go with kind of this virtual space that most of us are interacting in now. And so next generation coming up is video gamers, right? I mean, everybody plays video games on their tablet. I'm not saying that as a bad thing either. I do not want to discourage that. So I think spaces are going to be started to either reflect that more or are going to be the anti-virtual space. So I think those are the trends that we're going to kind of see in the most broad terms there.
Yeah, in the chat, I see Ludmila that says maybe the table d'hôte will become the next trend. People opening up their spaces and inviting people in and cooking, which is already starting, also as part of the gig economy because of, furloughs, as Ludmila points out, or many other reasons. So that's something that it's already there. That is going to be a set of practices and ways of getting together. I'm not sure if there will be an aesthetic or, a very recognizable approach because, table d'hôte, by definition, it's a reflection of different people. So
Yeah.
Who knows?
Well, we should wrap up. Maria, did you want to chime in on your prediction for the future before we?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, part of it is I wonder how all of this is going to be impacted by COVID. I think that our design is going to now lean towards more open air, more light. I think design is going to be completely different in the next 5 years, in part because people will want things that spill into the sidewalk. People will want garage openers. And I think that we're going to move towards more garage-esque restaurants and open hotel spaces, courtyards, because that's just what we're faced with at the moment. And so I wonder how many of these elements of the Edison light bulb or the reused materials will make their way to the outside elements. I believe that less and less because they're going to have to withstand the rain, the water, the cold. And so we'll see. But I have no doubt that COVID is going to lead to a complete rearrangement of what we expect in a restaurant.
Thanks, Maria. Before we close out, Brian, can you just throw in the chat, or Maria, those 2 books that you mentioned, the 2 taco books? Thanks. And then just a note for tomorrow, I will send a follow-up email to everyone and make sure that you can find Brian and Maria and Fabio on their various social media platforms, their websites. You can buy their books. There you go. And I'll add these to the email tomorrow as well. So thank you, everyone. This was so interesting. I loved this conversation. It was so good. It felt like I was back in grad school. Thank you, Fabio. Brian, Maria, thank you so much for joining us and enriching this conversation so much. And again, everyone, please just continue to stay safe. We're still doing our virtual events. We have so many more this month. Hi, Rana. So make sure you're signed up for the newsletter so you can find out about all of them. And hope to see you all soon. Good night, everyone. Bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.